He had once believed that he could have it all: the fast cars, the billion-dollar deals, the penthouse view. But Cameron Grant, the CEO of a thriving tech empire, soon realized that all the wealth and status in the world meant nothing when confronted with two small faces, identical in every way, staring at him with eyes full of questions he was unprepared to answer. The world he had built could not protect him from the reality he had just discovered. He was a father. Cameron Grant swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the neon lights of Manhattan flicker through the tinted windows of his high-rise office. He had spent the last decade of his life chasing success, and he had caught it. With a net worth well into the billions and a company that stretched across continents, there was nothing Cameron couldn't buy. Nothing except the peace of mind he once had. At 42, he sat at the helm of Grant Technologies, one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the world. His name was synonymous with success, his reputation built on strategic mergers and relentless ambition. Yet, despite all the power and wealth at his fingertips, Cameron felt an emptiness gnawing at him every day, a hollowness that money couldn't fill. The latest project was on his mind, of course. Another acquisition, another deal worth billions. His phone buzzed again, an alert from his assistant confirming the success of the European expansion. Cameron barely glanced at it. Numbers, deals. They had all become indistinguishable to him, a blur of zeros that no longer gave him the rush they once had. Cameron leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes drifting to the panoramic view of the city. But tonight, there was no peace in the view. He couldn't shake the thoughts that had been creeping up on him all day. Thoughts of someone he hadn't seen in years, someone who had walked out of his life long before his empire had taken shape. Her name was Amelia, his ex-wife. It had been 6 years since they'd parted ways, 6 years since the day he chose work over love. 6 years since he signed the divorce papers, dismissing her plea for balance, for a future together. Back then, he'd been so sure that his vision for the company was worth the sacrifice. He had told her that he would make it up to her later. That time would be their reward. But there had been no later, only work. And now, as he stood at the top of his empire, surrounded by luxury and success, Cameron realized that he had missed something far more valuable. Amelia, her laughter, her quiet support. And what else? What had he really lost in his pursuit of all this? His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. His assistant, Emily, entered with a briefcase in hand. "Mr. Grant," she began, "you have a visitor." "Who is it?" Cameron asked, his voice dry, annoyed at the interruption. Emily hesitated, a faint look of concern crossing her face. "It's Amelia." Cameron's heart stopped. Amelia. Of all the people to walk into his office, it had to be her. After all these years, what could she possibly want from him now? He didn't respond immediately, but his mind was racing. What had she come for? He hadn't spoken to her since the divorce, and even then, their conversations had been brief, businesslike. He hadn't heard from her in over a year. "Send her in," Cameron said finally, pushing his chair back and standing up. The door opened, and Amelia walked in, looking just as he remembered. Elegant, composed, yet her eyes betrayed the weight of something unspoken. Time had aged her face slightly, but it had done nothing to diminish her beauty. She still had that same quiet strength, the kind that made him want to trust her without a second thought. She paused as soon as she entered, clearly taken aback by the sight of him. Their eyes locked for a moment before Amelia cleared her throat. "I didn't mean to surprise you," she said softly, her voice steady but edged with something Cameron couldn't place. "But I didn't know where else to go." "Amelia," Cameron finally said, his voice betraying a mixture of shock and confusion. It's been a while. A long while. Too long. I know, she replied, her gaze falling to the floor before she raised her eyes again, determination shining through. I didn't come here for pleasantries. I came because of them. Them? Cameron's mind raced, and his heart skipped a beat. Amelia sighed, her eyes flicking toward the door. They're outside, Cameron. They're my daughters. Our daughters. The words hit Cameron like a punch to the gut. He froze. Daughters? He repeated, his voice barely a whisper. What are you talking about? I didn't want to tell you like this, Amelia said, her voice breaking slightly. But I can't hide it anymore. I didn't have a choice when we divorced, and I couldn't find the right time. But now... She paused, and Cameron could see the pain in her eyes. This wasn't just a surprise. This was something she had carried for years. A secret too heavy to bear alone. There are 2 little girls, Cameron, Amelia continued, identical twins. They're 5 years old. They're yours. Cameron's breath caught in his throat. 5 years old. Twins. His daughters. His mind reeled. How could this be possible? How had he not known? How had he let years go by without even knowing he was a father? Amelia's voice brought him back to reality. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, but I've been raising them on my own. They don't even know who you are. They never had a chance to meet you. And now, they're struggling. I'm struggling. Cameron looked at her, his heart pounding. Struggling? He echoed. What do you mean? They're hungry, Cameron. They've been living on the streets. I've been doing my best to keep them safe, but I can't do it anymore. I need your help. The words hit him harder than any business deal he had ever faced. He stared at her, his mind spinning. This wasn't about money, power, or success. This was about 2 little girls. His little girls. Without thinking, Cameron stood up and rushed toward the elevator, his mind consumed with the image of those 2 small faces, the faces of children he had never known, but who, in that moment, felt like the most important thing in his life. Cameron, wait! Amelia's voice called after him, but he was already gone, his mind set on finding the family he never knew he had. Cameron's mind was in a haze as he stepped into the cool night air, the weight of Amelia's words pressing down on him like 1,000 tons. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as he walked briskly down the street, his thoughts racing. His daughters, 5 years old, identical twins. It was impossible to comprehend. How had he not known? How had he missed this? As he approached the street corner where Amelia had pointed him, Cameron's heart began to hammer in his chest. The chaotic hum of the city seemed muffled around him, his focus narrowing only to the figure standing on the corner, holding a small cardboard sign. The harsh glow of a street light illuminated her face for a moment, and Cameron froze in his tracks. It was Amelia. But what caught his attention wasn't just her presence. It was the 2 little girls huddled close to her, wrapped in threadbare coats, their tiny hands clutching hers for warmth. They looked out of place in the harsh city streets, a stark contrast to the glass and steel of the skyscrapers that towered around them. Cameron's heart lurched. The girls were beautiful. They had her features, yes, but there was something else, something undeniable. Their faces, their eyes, they were his. "Amelia!" he called out, his voice breaking through the quiet of the night. She turned at the sound of his voice, her face registering the shock and surprise of seeing him there. She hesitated for a moment, clearly uncertain of how to react, before slowly stepping forward, pulling the girls closer to her. Cameron stood still, watching as they approached, his mind spinning. The first girl, slightly taller than the other, looked at him with wide, curious eyes. She had his sharp jawline, his dark brown eyes. The resemblance was undeniable. The second girl, smaller and quieter, had the same piercing gaze. They were perfect little replicas of him. "Cameron," Amelia whispered, her voice tight with emotion. I didn't know where else to turn." He could see the exhaustion on her face, the weight of years of struggle. And then he looked at the girls again, his daughters, and his heart broke. He took a hesitant step forward, his mind still racing with disbelief. One of the girls, the taller one, stepped forward as well, her little chin raised in a protective gesture that Cameron recognized from his own childhood. She looked up at him, her small face a perfect mirror of his own. "Are you okay, Mommy?" the girl asked, her voice full of concern. Amelia's face softened, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips as she answered, "Yes, Hannah. I'm okay." Hannah, his daughter's name. Cameron's breath caught in his throat. The other girl, smaller and quieter, tugged at Amelia's sleeve. "Mommy, I'm hungry," she said softly, her eyes wide with innocence. The words hit Cameron like a punch to the gut. How could he have missed this? How could he have let his own daughters suffer while he lived in a world of luxury and privilege? He had everything, and they had nothing. Without thinking, he took a step closer, his heart racing. "Come with me," he said, his voice gentler than he intended. "All of you. Please." Amelia looked at him, torn. Cameron could see the pride and the fear in her eyes, but the hunger in her daughter's eyes, the innocence that should never have to beg, was enough to break through her hesitation. "We'll get something to eat," Cameron said again, his voice softer now. "I can help. Please." She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Okay," she said quietly, gathering the girls closer. "Just dinner. Then we'll talk." As they walked through the city streets, Cameron could hardly focus on the passing crowds or the distant hum of taxis. His mind was consumed with thoughts of the twins, his daughters. His heart was still racing from the shock of seeing them for the first time. How had this happened? Why hadn't Amelia told him? And why had she kept them from him? They reached a small family restaurant a few blocks away, a place where families gathered for casual dinners. It wasn't the kind of place Cameron usually frequented, but he could tell it made Amelia feel more comfortable. The worn vinyl booths and the dim lighting felt more real than the exclusive restaurants he was used to. The twins were already seated, excitedly digging into their spaghetti, their faces lighting up with each bite. Hannah, the older one, looked at him with cautious curiosity, her eyes always searching his face. Grace, the quieter one, kept sneaking glances at him, as if trying to figure out who he was and why he was sitting across from them. Amelia sat beside them, her hands folded on the table, barely touching her own food. She was watching her daughters, her gaze flicking between them and Cameron, as if waiting for something to happen, something to change. Cameron took a deep breath, his mind swirling with questions. How had this happened? How had he missed out on the last 5 years of their lives? He tried to focus on the girls, but the weight of the questions pressing on him made it hard to concentrate. The whole situation felt surreal. "They're good eaters," Cameron said, trying to break the silence. His voice sounded awkward in the small space. Amelia smiled slightly, her eyes softening. "They're growing girls," she said, her voice quiet but warm. Hannah looked up at him with a serious expression. "Do you look like us?" she asked, tilting her head. Cameron felt a lump form in his throat. "I suppose I do," he said softly. "Yes, I think I do." Grace, the more inquisitive of the two, glanced at him and then at Amelia. "Are you our dad?" she asked, her voice small but direct. The question caught Cameron off guard, and he felt his heart tighten. He hadn't expected this. But as he looked at her, at both of them, he realized something. They already knew, in some way, that he was meant to be in their lives. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, something stronger than any deal or business venture. He was meant to be their father. The truth, though complicated and still shrouded in questions, had already begun to settle within him. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Cameron. His mind was still reeling from the sudden revelation. The twins, his daughters, were eating ice cream and laughing, their giggles echoing in the small restaurant. Amelia seemed calmer now, but there was still something in her eyes, something guarded. Cameron couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, more that Amelia wasn't telling him. When the ice cream had been finished and the check paid, they stood up, and Cameron felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility settle over him. He was no longer just a man living a luxurious, solitary life. He had 2 young girls now, and despite the shock of the situation, the realization was undeniable. They were his daughters, and he needed to be there for them. He didn't know how yet, but he would figure it out. As they stepped out of the restaurant, the crisp night air hit them, and Cameron watched as the twins rushed ahead, chasing each other down the sidewalk. They were so full of life, so full of promise. He couldn't bear the thought of them going through any more hardship. Amelia walked beside him, her pace slower. There was a tension between them now, one that hadn't been there before. She had spent years keeping this secret from him. She had lived a life without him, raising their daughters alone. He could only imagine the struggles she had faced, but what he couldn't understand was why she had kept it from him. "Amelia," he started, his voice soft but firm. "Why didn't you tell me about the girls?" She didn't answer right away, and for a moment, Cameron thought she might walk away from the question entirely. But she didn't. Instead, she stopped and turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and sadness. "I didn't want to ruin your life," she said quietly, her voice tinged with something Cameron couldn't quite place. "You were building an empire, Cameron. I knew how important Mitchell Innovations was to you. I didn't want to get in the way of that. I thought if I could just manage on my own, I wouldn't be a distraction. I didn't want you to feel like you had to give up everything for us." Her words hung in the air, and Cameron felt the weight of them. He wanted to say something, to argue that she didn't need to protect him from the truth, but he couldn't. Instead, he just nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. "I never meant to leave you out of their lives," Amelia continued, her voice shaky. "But I didn't know how to tell you. I was scared. I was afraid you'd reject them." "Reject me?" "I would never reject them," Cameron said, his voice firm. "I might not have known about them, but they're my daughters, and I need to be in their lives. I need to be a father to them." Amelia's eyes softened, but there was still hesitation in her expression. "It's not that simple, Cameron. There's so much you don't know, so much you haven't seen. They've been through things that I've protected them from, and now you're just here, wanting to play catch-up. I don't know if it's that easy." Cameron felt a pang of guilt at her words, but he didn't back down. "I don't expect it to be easy," he said quietly, "but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. I want to be a part of their lives, Amelia. I want to make up for lost time." The silence between them stretched out, and for a moment, it felt like everything was on the edge of falling apart. But then, as if by some unspoken agreement, Amelia nodded. Her shoulders slumped slightly, as if a weight had been lifted. "Okay," she said softly. "We'll take it slow. but I'm not going to sugarcoat it. They're my priority, Cameron. If you're going to be a part of their lives, you need to prove it." "I understand," he replied, his voice steady. "I'll prove it. I'll do whatever it takes." The next few days were a blur for Cameron. His mind kept returning to the twins, to the small faces that looked up at him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. He had promised himself that he would be there for them, that he would do whatever it took to become the father they deserved. But it wasn't just about proving it to them. He had to prove it to himself, too. For years, he had built his company, his empire, at the cost of his personal life. He had sacrificed relationships, friends, and now, it seemed, he had sacrificed the family that he didn't even know he had. He spent hours on the phone with his lawyer, making arrangements for visitation, and slowly, he began to put together a plan. He wanted to be there for his daughters, to be a father who showed up day after day, not just someone who sent checks or gifts from a distance. That afternoon, he received a call from Amelia, asking him to meet at the park the next day. The girls had a school performance, and she thought it would be a good opportunity for him to see them in action, to get to know them better. Cameron didn't hesitate. "I'll be there," he said, already planning what he would say to them. The next day, he stood outside Riverside Elementary, feeling the familiar tension of anticipation. He had never imagined himself in a situation like this. His entire life had been about control, about making the right moves and closing deals. But this was different. It wasn't about deals or numbers. It was about his daughters. The school was small, the courtyard bustling with parents and children, but to Cameron, it felt like the world had shifted. This was his new reality, and it felt realer than anything he had ever known. As he walked through the gates, he saw Amelia standing by the entrance, a small smile on her face as she waved him over. The twins were already inside, rehearsing for their performance. Cameron's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what to expect, but as he stepped forward, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. This was the first step, and no matter what happened next, he was ready. The performance was everything Cameron had expected, and more. As he sat in the crowded gymnasium, the familiar sound of chatter and clattering chairs all around him, he felt a sense of overwhelming pride and a touch of regret. The twins, Hannah and Grace, were on stage in matching costumes, smiling nervously as they prepared for their part in the school play. The whole performance was a simple retelling of The Giving Tree. But as he watched them, he couldn't help but feel like the real story was unfolding right before him. Hannah, the more reserved of the two, stood tall and serious, her brow furrowed as she played the adult tree. Grace, on the other hand, was animated, her wide eyes sparkling with excitement as she portrayed the youthful tree. They were opposites in so many ways, and yet, in so many others, they were a mirror image of him. As the performance came to a close, Cameron found himself clapping more enthusiastically than he intended. His heart swelled with emotion as the two girls took their bows. They weren't just his daughters. They were little versions of him, expressions, mannerisms, everything. After the play ended, Cameron found himself sitting in the back of the auditorium, trying to hold it together. His mind was racing. How had he let so much time slip away? All the meetings, the late nights, the deals. What had he been running after? He had always prided himself on being a man who was driven by success. But now, staring at his daughters, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed out on something far more precious. Amelia caught his eye as she approached, a smile on her face. But even in that brief exchange, Cameron could see that there was still something between them, something unspoken. "How are they?" Cameron asked, standing as she reached him. They did great, Amelia replied, her voice soft. They were nervous at first, but once they got into the play, they were fine. They really looked up to you when you clapped for them. Cameron swallowed hard, his heart swelling. They're amazing. Amelia gave him a small, knowing smile, but there was something else in her eyes now. Something that told him she wasn't entirely convinced that this was the right path. You've been here, Cameron, she said after a long pause, but I don't think you really understand what's at stake. These girls have been through so much. It's not just about showing up for them now. It's about proving you're going to stay, that you're in this for good. Cameron nodded, a heavy silence stretching between them. He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. This was just the beginning. He had to do more than show up. He had to be present, every day, for them. I'm not going anywhere, Amelia, he said, his voice steady, though a knot had formed in his chest. I know it's going to take time, but I'm here, for them, and for you, if you'll let me. She glanced at him, eyes searching his face, as if looking for any signs of insincerity. But Cameron knew what he had to do. This wasn't about regaining lost time. This was about starting from here. Now Amelia finally nodded, but her expression remained cautious. All right, but it's not just about the grand gestures. It's about the everyday, the late-night calls when they're sick, the school pickups, the little things. I get it, he said, his voice firm. I'm ready for that. I promise. The next few weeks were a blur of new routines. Cameron dove into fatherhood with everything he had, learning how to handle school drop-offs, how to comfort Grace when she had nightmares, and how to soothe Hannah's quiet, thoughtful nature. His life, once dominated by meetings and business calls, now included school plays, bedtime stories, and soccer practices. And he was starting to love it. But despite his best efforts, things were still complicated. Amelia, though she had agreed to let him become involved, remained wary. She was kind to him, but there was always a distance between them, an invisible line that Cameron couldn't cross. And then, one night, everything shifted. It was a Friday evening, and they had just finished dinner together, the four of them sitting around the table, eating pizza. Cameron was laughing at one of Grace's jokes when Hannah spoke up quietly, her voice tentative. Are you really going to be our dad? She asked, her brown eyes wide and serious. Cameron froze, his hand halfway to his glass of water. He had been prepared for this question, but somehow, hearing it from Hannah, who had always been so protective of her sister, hit him harder than he expected. He set his glass down carefully, his eyes meeting Amelia's across the table. Her expression was unreadable, but he could see the weight of the moment in her eyes. Yes, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I'm your dad. I always will be. Hannah looked at him for a moment, as if weighing his words. Then, without warning, she stood up and walked over to him. To Cameron's surprise, she wrapped her little arms around him in a tight hug. I'm glad, she whispered into his chest. Grace, who had been watching quietly, jumped up and joined the hug. Me too, she added, her small hands gripping his shirt tightly. In that moment, Cameron's world shifted. Everything he had feared, the rejection, the doubt, vanished. His daughters were his, and he was theirs. He closed his eyes, holding them both close, feeling the weight of the promise he had made to them. This was just the beginning. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't running from anything. He was where he was meant to be. The next morning, Cameron woke up early, just as the sun began to rise. The house was still quiet, the world outside just beginning to stir. He sat up in bed, his mind racing as he stared at the ceiling. There was so much more to do, so much more he had to learn. But today, he was going to take the next step. He pulled on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, grabbed his phone, and texted Amelia. "I want to take them to the zoo today. All of us. I think it's time for a real family day." He hit send, then stared at the phone for a moment, waiting for her reply. When the text came back, it was simple, but it made his heart race. "Okay, let's do it." Cameron smiled, feeling the familiar sense of hope rising inside him. Today was the day. The day he would show his daughters and himself that he was in this for the long haul. And as he headed down the stairs, ready to pick up his daughters for a day at the zoo, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to waste a single moment. The journey had only just begun. The zoo was alive with the laughter of children, but for Cameron, every sound felt new. Everything felt different. As he walked with Hannah and Grace, his heart, which had once been driven only by business, now swelled with a kind of joy he hadn't felt before. Amelia was beside him, but words between them were scarce. The moment spoke for itself. The girls were full of energy, racing from exhibit to exhibit, with Cameron's mind spinning in awe at how naturally they had accepted him. They weren't just his daughters. They were his second chance. As the day wore on, Amelia looked at him softly. "This," she said, "this is what family is. It's not about meetings or money. It's about being here, together." Cameron took a deep breath. "I've been so focused on the wrong things. I never realized what I was missing." Amelia's smile was gentle. "You've learned, and that's all that matters." But the unspoken tension still lingered between them. Cameron knew that their past wouldn't be forgotten overnight. They had to rebuild trust, not just as co-parents, but as something more. The road ahead was unclear, but they were willing to take the first steps together. As they left the zoo, the warmth of the day carried them forward. But in Cameron's heart, something had shifted. He wasn't the man he had been, chasing deals. He was a father, a man ready to take responsibility. The following days were a blur of new experiences, with Cameron becoming more involved in his daughters' lives. Family dinners, park visits, and quiet afternoons spent with Amelia and the girls felt like the world he'd been missing. Then, one night, Amelia sat beside him, her face serious but kind. "I think we can make this work," she said softly. "I'm ready to try, Cameron." His heart soared. "You mean it?" "I do," she whispered, smiling for the first time in a long while. And with those words, they took the first real step toward healing. Not just for their daughters, but for themselves. Their relationship had evolved from fractured remnants into something new, something stronger. In the weeks that followed, they found their rhythm. Cameron didn't have all the answers, but he was there, fully. And as the family moved forward, Cameron realized that success wasn't measured in numbers or deals anymore. It was in the moments shared, in laughter, in love. What he had once thought was the pinnacle of success, wealth and power, now seemed insignificant compared to the love he had found. In the end, it was family that made him the richest man in the world.